Before we kick off Stephen's talk, I just wanted to say a few words. Well, firstly, to thank the sponsors. You saw Microsoft up on your screen. So Microsoft have sponsored this event previously and this time as well. Basically gave us a check without any questions or conditions. So thanks very much to them, and also to NUS and the Department of Economics at NUS. Secondly, to thank the scientific committee. And I just wanted to mention a few names in particular who've gone beyond the call of duty and helped a tremendous amount in the program and lining up speakers and things like that, as well as chairing sessions. So on the theory side, Leslie Marks, who just chaired the one of the job market candidate sessions. So thank you, Leslie. She's done a lot on the theory side. On the empirical side, I had needed more help. So I have several people to thank, but mostly David Byrne, who I know is here, has taken care of a lot of things on the empirical side. Also, Panlaja Barwick has done a tremendous amount. So thanks to them. And from our department, Tiffany Sai has done a lot of vetting and also help in several sessions. The final announcement is for next year, the conference, I can say, will be held in Sydney, University of Sydney. Of course, that will be a physical conference. We said that last time, but it's a year away, so what possibly could go wrong? So we're looking forward to a physical conference in Sydney at the same time next year. So over to you, Robin.
Thanks, Julian, and good morning, everyone. Good evening for those on the East Coast. I'm here to introduce or reintroduce our keynote speaker, Professor Steve Barry of Yale University, where he is the David Swenson Professor of Economics and the inaugural faculty director of the Tobin Center. He's also a fellow of the Econometric Society and an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Professor Barry has produced a series of seminal papers on a wide range of topics within IO, including work on entry models, for which he won the Frisch Medal, the estimation of demand models of industry, estimation of dynamic models of industry competition, and the estimation and identification of demand systems for differentiated products. And this last topic will be addressed in his keynote today, which is entitled Foundations of Demand Estimation in IO. And finally, let me wrap this intro by noting that over the years, Professor Barry has served as a mentor and advisor to not only those at Yale, but also to many throughout the profession. So Steve, the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much. Let's see if I can share some slides here. Excellent. Thank you so much for those thumbs up. I am very happy to be here. Good morning to those of you on local time there, and I hope those on my time have had a little dinner, a little snack with them, something like that. But in any case, I'm very happy to be here. I want to talk today about a slight mashup of two joint works with Phil Hale. One that I've used our maybe overblown title for a handbook chapter here, Foundations of Demand Estimation in Industrial Organization, as the overall topic. And I'll structure the first third or so of my talk, a quarter or third of my talk around some broad issues there. And then, because it's always more fun to get into some deeper meat, I want to talk about a paper we've worked on actually for a very long time, still a working paper, on the identification using microdata, consumer level data. And it's been a long time, but actually I have a couple new results to talk to you at the end if you've seen it before. So anyone who's seen it before can hang on for that. So as I say, oh, and by the way, anybody who wants to ask a question, feel free. I'm used to being interrupted. If Robin notices something, he can catch my attention. Otherwise, I might not notice otherwise. So I'm going to start with just some broad background. And again, this handbook chapter actually already exists. It's even on the Elsevier website before they start charging you huge amounts of money for it. That covers a broad set of issues about demand estimation in IO. So let's think about a really broad background to start with. So we know that the Nobel Prize this year went in economics, went to some degree, went largely for the idea of a credibility revolution in empirical economics. And there are different ways of expositing what this means, but one way of thinking about it is a more serious emphasis on the identification of counterfactuals or quote unquote causal effects from some kind of quasi-experimental variation, as from instruments, discontinuities, geographic boundaries, panel data, diffs and diffs, event studies, and all kinds of things like that. Now, if you go back 10 or so years, a little more, some people involved in the credibility revolution have criticized empirical I/O. And I think one way of summarizing that criticism is that we estimate really complex models, and it's not clear to what degree your answer is being driven by the very specific assumptions in the model that you wrote down, which may be very complicated, to what degree identification is coming from something more fundamental, like the forms of quasi-experimental variation that are mentioned above, or to what degree the things just aren't really identified at all, I think would be the criticism. So that seems like a criticism one should respond to. And you know, I'll even admit that, you know, you can see in some cases where people might get the idea that a kind of a 80s or 90s style structural empirical I/O was pretty interested in models, pretty interested in questions, pretty interested in computation, but not always 100% clear about where identification came from. In the better works, I would like to think that there was a section on identification, might be a little hand wavy or something, but that people did think about these issues as they worked on these topics. So demand systems, I've worked on demand systems for a long time. Demand systems set the incentives for firms. And so today, what I want to talk about are some non-parametric identification results. It's not that I'm encouraging you necessarily to do non-parametric methods. The idea, I think, of a non-parametric identification result is to clarify essential sources of variation and to clarify then also the additional roles of parametric assumptions, which in practice, we're probably going to continue to use. Okay, why demand? You know, in some sense, there are many definitions of I/O, but one is that we're really interested in partial equilibrium, particularly in regulated industries where there are all kinds of interesting policy questions. And so since it's partial equilibrium, we're in some ways kind of extending and using supply and demand. And so, you know, at least half of that is going to be demand. Market power, for example, arises from the interaction between supply and demand. We look hard at own and cross price elasticities and defining markets and predicting the effects of mergers and I/O. And indeed, in much of applied micro outside of I/O, you really need demand and sometimes also supply, which I won't emphasize as much today, you know, to find out the effect of a carbon tax, to find out the effect of environmental regulation, to think about what's going to be the effect of school competition on prices and qualities, and maybe in the developing world that has private elementary schools. Just tons and tons of questions, real policy questions where you want counterfactuals, and you're going to need demand. Okay, so part of the first part of our handbook chapter is, first of all, you know, usual trick. First of all, to convince people that the question isn't maybe as easy as you thought it was. And then having done that, try to convince you that there actually is an answer. We all know about simultaneity, but what's interesting is if you go through, I don't know, some of the major textbooks, simultaneity is often treated, true simultaneity, where, you know, P causes Q and Q causes P, that sort of simultaneity, is often not emphasized very much. It's often a motivating example for endogeneity, and then off we go to talk about all kinds of other endogeneity. True simultaneity, though, really is different in some ways. In particular, unless you're going to introduce some measurement error or some very particular timing assumptions, as is done in the production function literature, simply controlling for stuff is probably not enough. The problem is, of course, is that if you control, let's say, in a demand system for everything, well, then you should get a perfect fit. Okay, you say, fine, I don't control for everything, right? But in demand, if you have imperfect competition or upward sloping supply curve, anything that you don't measure in demand is going to shift demand in an unobservable way, interact with that supply size, and recause the simultaneity problem. That you're dealing with the residual variation in P and the residual variation in Q, and unless that's pure measurement error or something's fixed in a timing assumption, simply controlling is not going to do it. You should get a perfect fit. And of course, one of the great ways of controlling for stuff is fixed effects. And sometimes I see people estimate a demand function and they say, don't worry, I have fixed effects and I'm quite sure that the fixed effects control for everything. But if they control for everything, why is P varying? And if P is varying, apparently the fixed effects didn't control for everything. What is that, right? If that's a demand error in the classic sense that's varying, or supply error moving around against a demand that isn't measured, you're going to get back to the simultaneity problem. So we can't just control for things. Okay, but there are lots of other approaches that aren't really controls. There are instrumental variable things. There are RDs and so forth. Here's something I want to be clear about, though. Most of the things we want to know, many counterfactuals, depend on knowing slopes of demand at a point, at a particular point of P and Q and the unobservable. So, for example, I always like to start with the first counterfactual I show the undergraduates when I teach the freshmen, which is the effect of an excise tax on buyer's price, just in single good supply and demand. And we know that that depends on ratios of demand and supply at a point, right? Ratios of one slope over the sum of two other slopes and so forth. That's the way these counterfactuals look in equilibrium situation. So even if you were willing to take an average counterfactual, that's not the average of one slope divided by the average of a sum of a couple of other slopes, right? For equilibrium counterfactuals, we typically need to know the levels and elasticity or elasticities of demand at particular points. That is, just as we teach the undergraduates, a true ceteris paribus effect, holding everything else fixed. That means we rarely want the average treatment effect in demand or supply. And as a particular example of an average treatment effect, it means we rarely want a latent average treatment effect, even as uncovered by a good IV. And the answer is, for example, if you use the late interpretation of IV in demand and then in supply, you're going to almost always get different late weights in demand and supply, and the ratios of those differently weighted objects are not going to be the counterfactual of anything. So following up on this idea that average treatment effects aren't enough for counterfactuals, the main challenge is going to be, how do we control for the unobserved demand shifters, the demand shocks, at the level of the good times the market, particularly as we move away from the single good case? We need to hold these demand shocks fixed to measure these relevant, complicated, well, not complicated, sometimes simple, but still nonlinear functions of different elasticities. So unlike other fields, we're often going to explicitly model the demand shocks. We're not just going to say there's something floating around, but they're really going to build them into the model and try to figure out what to do with them. So one way of thinking of the effect of why we want to hold fixed the demand shocks is, again, just to go back to intro and recall, in the case of multiple goods, that the quantity demanded of a given good depends on the prices and characteristics of all related goods, substitutes and complements. And if the latent demand shock is, say, an unobserved quality or characteristic of the other good, then to get this ceteris paribus slope, say, of demand as we change one price, we're going to have to hold all of those fixed. So, okay, let me start with some notation then. Q for quantity, not surprisingly, D for demand, X as a matrix of all the non-price observables, P as a vector of all the goods prices. Okay, and I'm really so sorry for this. Years ago, without much thought, I introduced XC as an error term, and I confess it looked a little bit like an E to me, and I'd already used epsilon elsewhere. And maybe I should have thought harder about it, particularly because in this work, Phil really wants random variable notation, which requires a capital, and that horrible unconnected letter is capital XC. I'm so very sorry. So that's our random unobservable. Okay, so the right-hand side of this equation has many endogenous variables and many latent shocks. So I want to say it's not even obvious how to proceed, how to get something other than an 8, other than an average treatment effect, even if prices were exogenous. If the prices were exogenous, we could get the expected Q conditional on X and P. That still wouldn't be demand at a given shock. Still would not be demand at a given shock. So in general, we might get an average or some weighted average of a derivative, but that's not typically what we want. And that's before we have a whole vector of endogenous prices, which is the more classic problem of simultaneity. So we really have two problems with demand in a demand system, which, by the way, is going to be a problem in many systems of simultaneous equations. We want to hold fixed for many unobservables. We don't want to just average over them. And then, of course, we also have many endogenous variables, right? So that's why demand is not that easy. Okay, not that easy, but also not hopeless. Also not hopeless. One part of this earlier paper that I wrote with Phil was to show identification of demand at the market level. And by the market level, I mean, we see different markets. Within the markets, there are different goods. Those goods have some observed characteristics. Those goods have some unobserved characteristics. They have prices. We want to identify that entire demand system. We don't see anything specific about consumers. That's the case we call market level data. The good news is that we do get identification of demand, and maybe not surprisingly, when we have instruments for all the endogenous variables, all the endogenous variables. And how many endogenous variables are there? If there are J goods, there are J prices, and there are J quantities. So again, from simultaneity, we knew that we needed instruments for price. The more surprising thing may be that in this context, we need instruments for quantities. And it's related to the fact that we're trying to control for these unobservables, which are specific to a price quantity pair. There are instruments available, which are basically the exogenous characteristics of the product. So we really need some exogenous characteristics of the products. And the intuition here, I think, is that if you need to change the choice set in order to learn about demand, okay? So we're changing the choice set through exogenous characteristics. Those are sometimes called the BLP instruments, even though I think we never called them that, but Vive Nouveau did or something. So here we go. The so-called BLP instruments. And in the non-parametric context, we also need shifters of costs or markups. And you can think of the exogenous characteristics as shifting quantity if you want, and shifters of costs as shifting prices. Okay. So we really need these exogenous characteristics. They have to be pretty high dimensional. And in the non-parametric case, we need, in addition, shifters of costs. And I think people in Monte Carlos have found you do, even though a parametric assumption might allow you to reduce the number of instruments, the idea of separate shifters for cost and separate shifters of the choice set is really very powerful. I think it's clear, even in a parametric context. Now, with demand identified, identification of supply is straightforward. Conduct hypotheses are testable. I'm not going to talk more about that. But once you've got demand, in some sense, supply at that point is often actually easier, more straightforward. What were our core assumptions for market level identification? Well, we need these instruments, which is actually the third bullet point. One way of thinking of our approach is that we begin with an index. And what the index is going to do, in my opinion, is it's going to tie these J unobservables each to a particular good, each to a particular dimension of variation. So let's say that X is a vertical observed characteristic. We're going to model XC as though it has a similar effect to a change in that vertical X, right? So an XC is like an unobserved X in this exact linear sense for at least one X. We've still got these J unobservables buried in the demand system. And so the second bullet point is going to deal with that. Assumptions that ensure that the demand system can be inverted to uncover the index, isolating the unobservables. And that index, by the way, also assigns at least one X to each product. So we have a notion of the own firm X, my X, and of my rival's X. So that's what this index and inversion assumptions are doing. And so this is a general approach you can think of with respect to simultaneous equations. Index, invert, IV. Okay, so that's the problem with demand. That's the solution in the case of market level data. Good news, bad news. Good news is things are potentially identified. Bad news is, oh my, that's a lot of instruments. Okay. Now, if you restrict the way that price enters, say, a discrete choice utility function, so that the effective price is controlled only by a few parameters, or it enters utility linearly, you may get by with fewer shifters for price, but you still need this exogenous variation in X of sufficiently rich dimension in order to estimate the richness of the substitution patterns that you're interested in. And again, parametric assumptions may help, but you still need these, I think you still need ideally these two sources of variation for price and choice set. There's an old idea that if you observed consumers within markets and the specific behavior of consumers, that you would be better off. Okay. By the way, you are not better off because you have gotten totally rid of the simultaneity problem. To the degree that there are market level unobservables and they're correlated with prices, the simultaneity problem is still here. So there must be something else about microdata that's useful, something about the richness of microdata that makes microdata useful. And I've always had this intuition. I've heard other people say it, oh, I don't really quite believe the identification of BLP at the market level, but if you had microdata, oh, then I would believe what they say. Okay, why? Right? Why do we all have this intuition that if you had consumer level microdata, you'd be better off? And this is something we've worked on for a long time, a long time. And I'm not going to claim I even now understand it totally, but I understand it a lot better. So I'm going to tell you what I understand now. Okay, what do I mean by microdata? It's obviously not just that you see some people. You have to, microdata is a link. It's a link between the choices of individual consumers to their consumer level observables. If there are no consumer level observables, then microdata is no different than market level data, right? We just count up the number of people who bought something, that's market level data. It's this link between the observed choice and the consumer level observable. Okay, we talked about all kinds of exogenous variation, and one of them was panel data. This gives an interesting and a different kind of panel structure. It's consumers within markets, and then we have variation across markets. So we have within market variation of consumers. What's interesting is that, particularly if we define a market as a fixed choice set, what's interesting then is that we're seeing consumers responding to a choice set which is held fixed. And we're going to show with a somewhat different index assumption that that's going to give us a source of variation that's a lot like a classic fixed effect variation. We're going to get a within variation. It's also going to turn out that the within variation is not going to be enough, at least not for the non-parametric case, not for the case where we let consumer level observables vary in a rich way. We're also going to need between market variation. And I kind of like this because when I was in graduate school, we always made a big deal about Gary Chamberlain and within and between variation, and we can come back and use an analogous argument here. Our main insights are going to be that microdata can allow both a more general demand model and also substantially reduce the number and types of instruments needed for identification. For example, we will no longer need the exogenous variation and the X's that avoid that define the choice sets. And indeed, right at the end, and this is something we've only understood fairly recently, we don't even need necessarily the characteristics to be exogenous at all. Certain cases of endogenous instruments will work. Characteristics will work. Okay, really, if you go back to the beginning of this literature, the microdata literature precedes the market level literature, right? McFadden, Talavetti, and Associates predicting the demand for a BART subway system that did not yet exist, used microdata tying the characteristics of households to their choices of transport mode. And critically, in that logit or nested logit analysis, they even tried random coefficients, by the way, utilities were shifted by interactions between consumer level characteristics and the characteristics of the choices. So things like household location, where were you located relative to bus stops? How long was it going to take you to drive to work? What was your income? Did you own a car? So, whether you own a car is obviously interacted with your choice of driving to work in an important way and so forth. Another very classic link or interaction between the characteristics of individuals and the characteristics of choices is distance. And you see this in all kinds of places, in the antitrust literature on hospitals. What hospital do you go to? Depends a lot on how far you're from a hospital. Now, for a more severe diagnosis, you may go farther. So your diagnosis interacts with distance, interacts with the nature of the hospital. School choice studies, distance always comes up. Residential choice, choice of jobs. I've been looking at the discrete choice of jobs to apply to. Distance matters a lot within commuting zone. People often assume a commuting zone is an undifferentiated market. Within commuting zone, distance matters a lot. When we worked on autos, when we worked on microdata, family size times the size of the car, whether you're in a rural area times whether it's a pickup truck, and so forth. So this is this classic thing that we see, which is an interaction between individual characteristics and the characteristics of the choices that you're making. So we're gonna want to see how much we can exploit that and how little structure we can place on it. So our consumer observables in this paper are going to be Z. A couple other cases we've called them D for demographics, so that's awkward because then you have D for demand too. I think discrete choice demand remains our motivating example, but the fact of the matter is in this paper we use the discrete choice almost not at all. Really, we're just identifying demand. I think it's often easy to motivate with discrete choice demand, but continuous demand, mixed discrete continuous, it's not really fundamental to our identification argument at all. We're only going to require shifters of cost or markup. There's going to be no BLP instrument style characteristics of other goods. And indeed, as I say, toward the end, I want to talk about the possibility that whatever X's they are not even exogenous. If you look at the discrete choice literature and identification, they often have some very special assumptions. And I'm going to argue that's because they don't use the equivalent of cross-market data. Now, by the way, these papers are not written in an IO context usually, and there's no notion of a market. So it's not surprising that they don't use cross-market variation, but I think that's why we can go a lot farther. We have people within markets and multiple markets. So for example, the kind of assumptions that the pure econometrics literature often makes for the non-parametric identification of discrete choice models is a special regressor. And that special regressor often has a number of properties. One is you may need to exclusively assign a particular Z to the utility of a good. So there has to be a Zij that only shifts the utility of good J. Now, that kind of works for distance if you have two choices, maybe, but three choices, distance doesn't R2 doesn't really vary independently in R3. We did, when we looked at automobiles, consider having just certain interactions affect certain goods or certain characteristics, but looking back at it, I don't really know why. I mean, if being rural affects your taste for a pickup, doesn't being urban also affect your taste for a pickup? I don't even understand what that means. Or if rural probably affects your taste for a car too, right? The exclusive assignment in some cases is clear, in many cases it is not. These papers often require a large support for that Zij. It might have to go plus minus infinity, for example, each of those Z's. We're not going to require that, although we will have some support assumption. And there's often a kind of independence or mean independence assumption between the Z's and some kind of explicit shock. We're not going to require that explicitly, although there is going to be, it is true that as we move across markets, in some sense, the relationship between Z and demand has to be the same. Okay, so it's not quite anything can happen. Okay, so we are going to have to make some assumptions. We're not going to get something for nothing. We are going to require an index restriction and some invertibility assumptions. This is to some degree, but not perfectly analogous to the index invert assumptions in our market level work. We are going to need excluded instruments for prices. To be completely non-parametric, we're going to need something that is an instrument for each price. Also, for the Z's to trace out some interesting substitution patterns, or perfectly unrestricted substitution patterns, I should say, we will also need J elements of Z. We will not need them to be exclusively defined. We're not even going to assign them to or interpret their effect on the utility of any different product at all, but we would have to have a sufficient number of them to get the kind of dimension of substitution that we're interested in. We are going to have a common choice probability assumption, which is a kind of support assumption that I'll come back to later. Okay, let me give the model. This is a little mathy part, and I don't know if you're going to follow it or not, but we're going to do a little bit of math in the middle, and then I'll try to summarize at the end and talk about some extensions and observations. So this may help some people, it may not help some people. I promise not to spend that much time on it. Okay, multinomial choice, still J goods, an outside option, and we have a market. What's a market? It's a vector of observables. These could be the characteristics of goods. They could just be broad demand shifters that are common to this market. We have a price vector. It really is J-dimensional. X may not be J-dimensional. We have this vector of horribly notated product market unobservables, J-dimension, one for each good. And we have a distribution in each market of consumer-specific observables. The Y's are things we're just going to condition on, and the Z's are things that we're going to use to trace out something in the data. So we introduced the Y's just to make it clear. There can be other stuff floating around. We'll drop them later. Okay. Again, there's one unobservable for each good. We're not going to assign any Z's to the utility of any good, and we're not going to make an independence assumption. Now, we're not going to require the independence of X and XC either. I'll come back to that at the end. We are going to have to be careful that if X is endogenous, we're going to have to check and see, are our instruments still good or not? So that's going to be the critical thing. It could be endogenous, but controlling on it has to leave us with valid instruments. And of course, if you want to learn the so-called causal effect of a change in X, it's going to have to be exogenous, or you're going to need an instrument for it. Okay, C is the choice environment that an individual consumer faces. So it's everything fixed in the market, which is X, P, C, and then it's everything that's observably specific to the consumer, which is Z and Y. And demand then, it's a sigma because it's a market share in the discrete choice context. So we're looking for something like S. So it's sigma, a choice. The vector of choices, the vector of choice probabilities, if you will, are a function of the consumer's choice set. So our goal is to identify that function on the support of the choice set. Okay, at every point in the support of that choice set. Now that's a pretty general demand system there, sigma of C, and we're going to need some assumptions. Okay. We are going to make an index assumption. So there's going to be an index of the key points in that blue thing under the first assumption, that gamma index. We're actually going to condition on the Y and the X. And so in the end, it's importantly going to be an index of Z and XC. Okay. We're going to be able to invert for that index. And furthermore, the index itself is invertible on Z. In other words, there's a one-to-one relationship between Z and the index. Injective, not really one-to-one. Okay, I don't want to pause too long on that generality of the index, because really it's going to be linear in the unobservable. This is going to be our fixed effect framework. You can move G within market by moving Z, the consumer observable, and hold XC, the unobservable, fixed. That's going to be the basis of our fixed effect argument. Okay. Demand is not linear in this thing. Demand can be a wild function of these indices, but the indices themselves have this fixed effect framework. Okay, some regularity conditions. Okay, as I say, the easiest thing to motivate our example would, in fact, be to go back to a discrete choice framework, the kind we usually write down, right? So consider the utility function at the top, which I hope is familiar to a bunch of people. This has random coefficients. The kth random coefficient is shifted by all of the z's, coefficients, all of the z's, and some random terms new. When we say we don't make any independence assumption, there doesn't have to be independence between z and nu, but that's the classic assumption. Really, just the z's just have to shift the betas. I don't care how. There's a random coefficient on price here, which is shifted by y, which is an example of something we can just condition on. And we can rewrite the above as it is below in blue. So that utility is a function of an index G that's a function of Z and X and is linear in XC, and then all the random terms captured in mu. Okay. So that is an example of our G index given at the bottom, a bunch of interactions between Z's and X's that generate an index specific to good J. It depends on Z. On the other hand, that's just a parametric example. We're not going to impose anything like that for the non-parametric analysis. In real life, on a finite sample, we might impose something like that. Okay, let me sketch the identification results. Okay, we have this demand system here, except that Z and XC enter as an index. We're also going to have, we have here, by the way, condition on X and Y. I'm going to come back to that later. That means we're observing prices in a market. And then at the consumer level within each market, the match between the Z's and the Q's, the outcomes. And we're going to have a vector of excluded instruments, W, that we'll introduce when we need some instruments. And we're going to proceed basically in 2 steps. First of all, and I think this is the new part of the argument that uses the fixed effect, we're going to identify the index function, the G itself. And we're going to identify that from a combination of within and between market data. We're then going to use an IV step to identify the demand shocks. And then you might say we still have to identify demand in total, but actually by that point, there's nothing unobservable. And so demand is just immediately observable to us. Okay, so that script S is the support of the shares or the quantities. So let me impose the index assumption in that equation at the top. So the demand function, the share function, sigma, is a function of this instrument, and at a given Z star, given our invertibility assumptions, each market share S will be associated with a given consumer or consumer type Z star, a given vector of consumer unobservables. So that means we can write, there's a person in every market who's associated with the share, that's a Z star person who's associated with share vector S. Now, that's a function of XC, although I don't know what function it is, and a function of P, but I do see the Z star in every market, right? I don't know what the XC is associated with it, but I see it. I can go look what kind of person makes this choice. And that lets me then write this inverted demand system at the bottom, where we're using the inversion. So the index is equal to the inverted system at S, at a given share vector S that's seen in this market, and the market price P. Okay, Z star is observed, S is the associated S is observed, P is observed, XC is not observed, G is not observed, sigma inverse is not observed. Let me rewrite that at the top. And let me differentiate it. And here's where the linearity is great. And here's where the index assumption is really going to make things go. As I move across market, changing the observed market share vector S, I move the kind of consumer who chooses with that probability. That changes the unknown G and the unknown inverse market share, but the XC drops out. So I never have to worry about the XC when I'm looking at within market differences. Now, it turns out if I do that in another market, call that T prime, with the same price and the same S, but because it has a different XC T prime, it has a different Z star, I can start linking the markets together. I can actually substitute out for the partial derivative of sigma inverse on the right-hand side in the second equation. I get this observed thing on the right-hand side of the last equation. And if I knew one partial derivative of G with respect to Z, I start learning new ones through something that's observed. And then, and this surprises me, we're so general and we have tied things down so little that we actually have a free normalization at G, on G, at 1Z. We start there and you move through a bunch of overlapping markets and you identify the entire vector, the entire unknown function G, no exclusion restrictions. Now, to go to the next step, there's going to have to be some choice probability vector, S star, that is reached in every market for some consumer that has a particular Z that's special to that market. I always like to think about the voting example. You can find somebody in my home state of Connecticut, which is very liberal, who has a 50% probability of voting for a Democrat and a Republican presidential candidate. That person's probably a little bit rich and a little bit low education. You can also go to a very conservative state like Alabama and find a different person who has a 50-50 probability of voting, but the demographics of that person in Alabama are going to be different because the average unobserved taste, the XC for the Democrats and the Republicans, are different. But you can still find somebody with a 50-50 voting probability, and that's our common choice probability assumption. It's something you can check in the data. We plug that common choice probability back into our inverted demand equation. We plug it in for every market, and with the associated consumer or voter or whatever it is who makes that choice in that market. And we have shut down the variation due to market shares, due to quantity. We already know the G. All that's left to learn is the sigma inverse function at S star, which is a function of P. S star doesn't move across markets. This is like a non-parametric IV equation. The S star is fixed by our prior procedure. I just need instruments for price. With instruments for price, I learned sigma J inverse of S star in every market. You say, well, that's not what you want. No, but once I know that, I know XC. That's the second to last bullet point. Once I know XC, I know everything. There's nothing unobservable. I know demand everywhere. So that's the identification of demand. Let me discuss that math for 5 minutes or so, some extensions and conclusions, and then maybe Robin can run a little discussion before we get to the end. Okay, so what's going on? Microdata is allowing us to replace the IVs for quantities with microdata variation via Z. And it's this fixed effect assumption that lets us, in some sense, change choice sets. We're really changing the people while holding the XC fixed. The exogeneity of this, though, is not from an exclusion restriction. It's not from an independence restriction. It's from the fact that within a single market, market level demand shifts don't vary. Right? So they're a lot like the estimation of slope parameters from within variation in a panel data model. We've transformed our model to the point where that's true. On the other hand, I want to say that we have both an unknown G and an unknown sigma inverse. So it turns out we can learn something about the relationship between those two things within a single market. We need that multiple market. We need to use our normalization once and then move across multiple markets. So we really need the between market variation as well. Okay, so what else do we go through in the paper that's of interest? So what instruments can we use? We can use any cost shifter, any markup shifter. We just need, if we think they're exogenous, any exogenous thing that shifts price we can use. But there are other things that are going to shift prices. For example, demographics may vary across markets. And if that's an exogenous variation, if it doesn't vary with the XCs, that aggregate level demographic variation is available as an instrument. And recall that because this is a microdata model, we've controlled for the demographics of the consumer, right? And we have excluded in functional form then the demographics of everybody else, because it's just one person making a choice. Now you could write down selection models or sorting models or something that would make aggregate demographics. You know, if people move to this town because they like the XCs of the products, then that IV will fail. But otherwise, these are the IVs that we've called in the past Waldvogel IVs. Joel Waldvogel pointed out that your choice set and the prices you face vary not just with who you are, they vary with, in the case of oligopoly with fixed costs, with who your neighbors are. So who your neighbors are a possible instrument here. They can't be an instrument, by the way, in the market data context, because if they shift demand, we have to include them in the aggregate demand function, right? So they might be a demand shifter, but they're not excluded. Okay, we still need J cost shifters to get a non-parametric answer, okay? And do we really have J cost shifters or J really good Waldvogel instruments that shift all the different prices? If not, you might want to make some other assumptions. For example, if you include the X's more explicitly in the model, for example, you include them in an index of Z and P and X, you may suddenly have the BLP instruments available. Okay, otherwise we've just conditioned on X. You could further reduce the number of instruments needed, for example, by writing down a parametric model where there aren't that many parameters influencing price. If there's only one parameter on price, you might need one instrument. Two parameters, a mean and a variance of a log normal, maybe you need two parameters or three parameters. And the other thing a parametric assumption can let you do is to reduce the required dimension of Z. So to get a non-parametric function, we need a J-dimensional Z, but let's say I only want to estimate 2 levels of a nested logit. We can show you don't need such a high dimension of Z. And so there's going to be a frontier of trade-offs between what kind of non-parametric, semi-parametric, parametric functional forms we want to write down and what we're going to need in terms of identifying demand. Let me stop then the new results with talking about endogenous product characteristics. It's a hard thing in the market level data to argue that market characteristics are exogenous, that they're uncorrelated with the XCs. And you can tell all kinds of stories why they should be correlated with the XCs. Among them are many models of product choice. Maybe you see your XC and you choose your X. Or maybe you choose your X and that generates systematically a different XC, right? Now, sometimes, as for an antitrust analysis, all we really want, or the first thing we want, let's say, maybe not all we want, the first thing we want is just a price elasticity in each of the affected markets. And we're willing to do a short run analysis of holding X fixed. So this raises the question, can you simply control for an endogenous X and still get a good price elasticity? I don't think it's possible in the market level case. Here, it does turn out to be possible because we did the entire identification argument conditional on X. Indeed, that almost seems like a piece of magic. It seems like we never put any assumption on X at all. And indeed, it's kind of true. We never put any assumption on X at all. On the other hand, we did say we had a valid instrument. And our entire argument was conditional on X. So to be valid, therefore, the instrument must be valid, conditional on X, right? And when is an instrument valid, conditional on an endogenous X, right? It turns out this is super related to the literature on good and bad controls. When can you include a control which is not necessarily exogenous, but is either okay or even more improves the situation? If X is a good control, and what I mean by that is the instrument is still valid conditional on it, we can identify price elasticities in market T even when X is endogenous, although of course you're not going to get a causal effect of X, and if X is exogenous, you can also get the causal effect of X. Otherwise, you might need some instruments for X. Okay, so let me give you 2 causal graphs, okay? And you can draw many such graphs. This isn't original to us, right? So here's an example of a causal graph. So the arrows just represent the direction of causation. Let's say that a firm is born with popularity of its product, right? But XC actually influences its choice of X. Okay, and let's say further that X influences a cost of production W. Is W a valid instrument conditional on X? And the answer in this causal graph is yes. X blocks the effect of the correlation of XC and W. Indeed, in this graph, W is only a valid instrument conditional on X. Okay. However, X is endogenous. As X varies, you're picking up the variation of Xc as well. So you can't get a causal effect of X, but you can have a valid instrument. Okay, here's the classic example of a bad control, a collider. The firm is given the unobservable and W, and it jointly looks at those and determines X. Okay. In this causal example, W is an instrument for P unconditional on X, but once you condition on X, that creates a correlation between W and Xc, right? X is picking out a slice of Xc's, right? And therefore picking out a slice of W's that are correlated with those Xc's. So if X is a bad control, you're in trouble, right? X is endogenous. I don't know how you get, you're gonna have to get an instrument someplace else from a W that doesn't look like this. Okay, so let me finish here. Then we can maybe have just 5 minutes for discussion. I'm happy to stay afterwards too. Again, let me emphasize our point at the beginning. We are not presenting conditions for nonparametric identification as necessarily a step toward nonparametric estimation. If you have 100 cars, you're not going to estimate it nonparametrically, sorry. It's also not a case where if you don't satisfy the exact conditions, we say you can't do any empirical work, right? What we do think of them as is that they're revealing where should we place emphasis? What are the key sources of variation? What are the kind of instruments we needed? Where would we kind of have some smoothing or some dimensionality reduction? Therefore, we can explain perhaps why we choose a particular functional form. We've got 2 or 3 really good instruments for price. Okay, I can maybe have more than one parameter on price, but maybe not 30. And hopefully what this then gives us is some confidence in our empirical work, an indication of where we should be looking for the kind of sufficient variation that can let us maybe reply to our critics. You should give some credibility to our work as we analyze demand. Good, so I'm going to stop there.
All right. Thank you very much, Steve. So at this point, we're actually happy to open up the floor to questions. If you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand or message me, and I will call on you, at which point you can unmute yourself. I have one question right now, actually, from David Byrne, and then I can also ask my own. David?
Thanks, Rob. Hey, Steve, just if I can follow this, see if I'm following it. I was curious your thoughts on estimation and thinking of, like, particularly with the getting at the G part. If I follow correctly, there's a sense in which you're like pairing up or matching folks to net out that unobservable. And I'm just curious your thoughts on just in implementing this or getting to an estimator off of the
exactly
argument.
So
I'm just curious, like, and I'll finish this on like the tension between like how rich we're going to make the model and the ability to match and deal with that. I was just curious your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so there are a couple things. One is, I didn't really mention this, but existing, I sort of mentioned this at the beginning. Existing results show if you greatly restrict G, you actually can learn about the nature of demand from one market, right? So what I would say is, I would suggest that people try to get their G function pretty rich. Okay, one form of pretty rich is you just throw in the Z's you have, even if it's linear or something, right? But you don't sort of accidentally exclude some Z's just because what the heck, right? My worry is that the what the heck is now going to suddenly identify demand. And if it was really just what the heck, then that's maybe not how you wanted to identify demand. Or make an argument. No, really, this I can exclude a Z from G. That's actually going to buy you some identifying power, and so lean into it. Then say, okay, fine. Yeah, I get it. I don't have that many instruments, and I don't have that many markets, and I'm going to exclude some Z's, right? So what I would say the G thing tells me is you could accidentally buy some identifying power for that I don't know if people are realizing, and I think that either says make it a little bit flexible, like at least include the Z's somehow. Or lean into the exclusion, right? To say, no, it's really excluded. I mean, the distance to one hospital is not the distance to another hospital. That's only 2 dimensions, but at least it's 2 dimensions.
Right.
and kind of lean into it. But I'm imagining that people are doing estimation in not that different a way. In other words, you're going to maybe write down a discrete choice model. There are a bunch of Z's and there's some random coefficients, and that unless you really only have two choices, two choices and an outside good, you're still going to use the same kind of parametric forms.
Sure.
I'm just hoping people can kind of match up their assumptions to the specification.
Right. Great. Thanks.
And another question, Steve. So one of the exciting developments in recent years has been collection and access to even richer and richer forms of data, right? On micro level choices and things of that nature.
Yep.
I know on your last slide you had said, you mentioned this is not quite what your papers have been about, but are there, the most promising dimensions along which you see researchers extending are parametric workhorse demand models, perhaps informed by the work you've done here?
Yeah. So, the thing I'm interested in, and I maybe only semi-coincidentally have a number of empirical projects with younger people going, is in some sense exploring these different dimensions and actual applications. How much does it help to add multiple markets, right? Can I get a richer G the more markets I have? Can I get more random coefficients the more microdata I have, right? That there are just kind of these kind of a little bit, I think, unexplored to me dimensions that we don't routinely show robustness with respect to in empirical applications. And I'm pretty interested in that. Like, can we convince our colleagues outside of IO that our work is more credible because, look at what I'm getting from this super rich microdata, but also the cross market variation and so forth, right? That I'm not really just leaning into one thing. And on the other hand, I also think I think anything like this on the pure methodological side, again, questions of in microdata, what are the optimal instruments? I think people like Isaiah Andrews and his team have some thoughts about, what does the first stage look like? In other words, how would you convince someone that your variation is powerful before you got to your model? Is there a quasi first stage, right? Okay, you can do the quasi first stage on price. Well, what about this micro variation thing? Is there some way you could show that it's powerful, like without just estimating the whole damn thing? I think that's kind of interesting too. Like, can you display the power of your data in something like a quasi first stage? What's the equivalent of a parallel trends assumption? That just popped up. I have no idea what those words even mean as they come out of my mouth.
All right. Well, I think at this point we can move on from the formal Q&A session, given we're at 8. But I think we're happy to leave the floor open for an informal Q&A. Steve, you mentioned, thank you for being generous with your time. But before I do that, let's just all express our appreciation to Steve for that great talk. Thank you.